Jonathan Mercer believed weakness had
Who
no
is
place
she?
in power.
We need to stop pretending.
So he removed his pregnant wife from his life.
I was there
thinking
when
it
your
would
company
protect
almost
his
collapsed.
empire.
That was then, this is now.
What he
I'm
didn't
building
realize
something bigger than
was
this
that she
family can
understood
hold.
his company better than he ever did. And within weeks, the empire he protected began collapsing from the inside. Jonathan Mercer had built Mercer Global Holdings from a two-room office into a multinational powerhouse that controlled logistics corridors across 3 continents. Business magazines called him disciplined, visionary, relentless. He appeared on panels speaking about legacy thinking and long-term dominance, always photographed in tailored suits with a controlled half-smile that suggested both confidence and restraint. Investors trusted him. Employees feared disappointing him. The public admired him. Inside the Mercer estate overlooking the Hudson River, however, discipline had begun to rot into distance. Clara Mercer moved slowly through the marble foyer that evening, one hand resting unconsciously on the curve of her 3rd trimester belly. The house felt larger lately, quieter in the wrong way. For months Jonathan had been emotionally absent, late meetings, private calls taken behind closed study doors, sudden business trips that required no assistant coordination. She had noticed the shift before she could define it. She had also chosen not to confront it too quickly. Timing mattered. What she did not expect was to hear another woman's voice in her kitchen. Clara paused at the archway leading toward the open concept living space. Laughter, light, deliberate, unfamiliar, floated through the room. She stepped forward, her expression steady but tightening as she saw Vanessa Cole standing beside the island counter, one hand resting casually on the marble as though she belonged there. Vanessa was composed, elegant, confident in a way that suggested rehearsal. She wore a fitted blazer, not evening attire, business casual, controlled. Not accidental. Jonathan stood beside her, not surprised. For a moment, silence stretched across the room like a drawn wire. Clara's voice, when it came, was calm. "Who is she doing in my house?" Vanessa did not answer. She looked to Jonathan, a subtle signal that this was his confrontation to manage. Jonathan exhaled as if tired of an inevitable conversation. "Clara, we need to stop pretending." "Pretending?" Clara repeated softly. Vanessa's eyes flicked briefly toward Clara's stomach before returning upward. "You deserve honesty," she said carefully, almost sympathetically. Clara ignored her. Her gaze remained fixed on her husband. "I'm carrying your child." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but his tone remained controlled. "And I'm building something bigger than this family can hold." The words did not explode. They landed. Clara stared at him, processing the sentence not emotionally, but structurally. Bigger than this family. Bigger than responsibility. Bigger than loyalty. Vanessa stepped forward slightly. "Jonathan has outgrown this chapter," she said, voice measured. "He needs a partner aligned with where he's going." Clara's eyes shifted to her for the first time. Aligned with what? Ambition without conscience? Jonathan's expression hardened. "You don't understand what expansion requires." "I understood it before you did," Clara replied quietly. "I was there when Mercer Global almost collapsed during its second-year liquidity crisis. I negotiated that survival." "That was then," Jonathan snapped. "This is now." There it was, the dismissal. Not of her role as wife. Not even of her pregnancy. But of her relevance. He had convinced himself that evolution required replacement. Vanessa rested a hand lightly on Jonathan's arm, the gesture intimate but strategic. "You deserve a partner who matches your ambition," she murmured. Clara saw it then. This was not emotional chaos. It was narrative restructuring. Jonathan had already rewritten the story in his head. Clara was no longer foundational. She was restrictive. "Are you asking me to leave?" Clara asked. "I'm telling you," Jonathan replied, his voice losing patience. "This house, this life, it's not yours anymore." Security had already been notified. That detail revealed premeditation. 2 uniformed guards appeared at the edge of the hallway, hesitant but obedient. Clara felt the shift physically, not just in marriage, but in power. "You're throwing your pregnant wife out of her home," she said quietly, not pleading, not breaking. Jonathan avoided her eyes. "You'll receive a settlement." "A settlement." Vanessa's gaze remained steady, almost curious, as though observing how resilience fractures under pressure. Clara did not cry. She did not argue further. She walked upstairs slowly, packed a single suitcase with essentials, documents, 1 framed photograph, a change of clothes. She moved with composure that unsettled Vanessa more than hysteria would have. As she passed Jonathan in the foyer, she paused. "One day," she said softly, "you'll realize power without loyalty collapses faster than you built it." Jonathan said nothing. He had already convinced himself that removing emotional weight would sharpen his leadership. The front doors opened. Rain poured down in steady sheets across the circular driveway. A driver stood waiting, instructed not to ask questions. Clara stepped into the storm, one hand shielding her stomach as she moved toward the car. The security guards did not meet her eyes. Inside the mansion, Vanessa exhaled slowly. "You did the right thing," she said. Jonathan stared through the glass as Clara's car disappeared beyond the gates. "Weakness," he muttered, almost to himself. "Weakness limits growth." He believed it. He believed that cutting her out would strengthen his empire. He did not yet understand that he had just severed the very structure that held it together. As Clara drove through the rain, windshield wipers struggling against the downpour, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her reflection in the rearview mirror looked composed, not shattered. She scrolled past family contacts, past friends, and selected a name she had not called in years. Eleanor Whitaker. The woman who once warned her, quietly, that ambition without character always creates its own downfall. The phone began to ring. Clara Mercer did not cry when Eleanor Whitaker answered the phone. She did not explain what had happened in emotional fragments. She stated facts. "Jonathan removed me from the house tonight. I'm 8 months pregnant. I need to review the prenup and corporate equity agreements." There was a pause on the other end of the line, not shock, but confirmation. Eleanor Whitaker had been a senior partner at Whitaker & Doyle for 3 decades, a firm known for dismantling billion-dollar illusions. She had mentored Clara before marriage, back when Clara was one of the sharpest legal strategists in New York corporate law. "I warned you once," Eleanor said calmly. "You signed more than a marriage certificate. You signed leverage." Clara stared through the rain-streaked windshield. "Then let's calculate it." Before she became Mrs. Mercer, Clara Hayes had built a reputation as a quiet architect of high-stakes contract strategy. She understood regulatory blind spots, voting structures, liability containment, and, most importantly, timing. When Jonathan was still pitching Mercer Global out of borrowed office space, Clara drafted the early supplier contracts that prevented catastrophic exposure during the company's second-year liquidity crisis. She structured equity protections that shielded Mercer from predatory investors. She was not the public face. She was the firewall. Flashbacks moved through her mind not as nostalgia, but as documentation. She remembered sitting across from hostile board members who doubted Jonathan's expansion plan, subtly redirecting conversation until the risk appeared measured instead of reckless. She remembered burying a potential scandal involving procurement irregularities by advising internal disclosure before regulators could intervene. She had protected Jonathan's name before the public ever knew it could fracture. Then she stepped away. When Mercer Global began climbing aggressively, Clara made a decision that now felt heavier. She paused her own career to stabilize their domestic life, believing Jonathan needed uninterrupted focus. "This is temporary," he had told her at the time. "Once we scale, we both step forward." Scale arrived. Recognition followed. But stepping forward became singular. Eleanor met Clara the next morning at her firm's Upper Manhattan office. No sympathy was offered. Only analysis. Jonathan believes control equals dominance, Eleanor said, reviewing scanned copies of the prenuptial agreement. But he forgets something important. You were there before valuation stabilized. Clara leaned forward slightly. What are you seeing? Eleanor tapped a highlighted clause. You retained early equity grants from year one, dormant voting shares converted during the second funding round. They were never restructured under later holding entities. Clara's pulse remained steady. How many? Enough to matter in a tight vote. The significance did not show on her face, but it recalibrated the boardroom landscape entirely. Meanwhile, across the city, Vanessa Cole was stepping into visibility with confidence sharpened by opportunity. Business outlets ran photographs of her beside Jonathan at a corporate networking event. Headlines read, CEO embraces bold new chapter. The narrative framed transition as evolution, not betrayal. Clara watched one of those segments later that afternoon from Eleanor's office. Vanessa smiled gracefully for cameras, speaking about modernizing leadership alignment. Jonathan stood beside her, composed, projecting inevitability. He's rewriting the story publicly, Eleanor observed. He always does, Clara replied quietly. He just forgets who drafted the earlier versions. They shifted focus back to documentation. Clara reviewed Mercer Global's corporate bylaws for the first time in years, not as wife, but as strategist. Language around fiduciary responsibility, asset shielding, and spousal equity rights took on new significance. She noticed something subtle in the timeline of recent amendments filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Pull last month's asset transfer disclosures, she instructed. Within hours, Eleanor's research team returned with filings. Clara scanned them carefully, tracing movement of major assets into a newly formed subsidiary aligned suspiciously close to Vanessa's consulting firm. The transfer occurred 3 weeks ago, Eleanor said. Before he removed me, Clara corrected. The timing felt deliberate. Jonathan had not acted impulsively. He had prepared financially before restructuring domestically. Is it clean? Clara asked. Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. It may not be. Corporate officers are restricted from shielding assets in ways that undermine shareholder interests during pending material life events, especially those with potential litigation exposure. Clara's pregnancy, combined with marital restructuring and executive asset movement, created a narrow but dangerous legal window. He accelerated the transfers, Clara murmured. Too fast. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. If those transfers were executed with insider knowledge of upcoming marital action, and if they materially altered valuation structures, you may have grounds for injunction. Across the city, Jonathan concluded a board call where he confidently assured directors that domestic matters would not interfere with corporate stability. Vanessa sat beside him, offering subtle reinforcement. Optics will normalize, she said afterward. Control the messaging. Jonathan believed he had neutralized weakness. He did not realize Clara was not reacting emotionally. She was mapping. That evening, alone in a temporary furnished apartment Eleanor arranged, Clara opened her laptop and reviewed the asset movement one more time. Her legal instincts sharpened around a single detail, a filing timestamped at 11:47 p.m. on a night Jonathan had claimed to be traveling for business. She cross-referenced it with internal scheduling archives she still had access to. He had not been out of state. He had been restructuring. And if he executed those transfers in anticipation of marital litigation while still presenting corporate stability to shareholders, he had not just betrayed his wife. He may have violated federal fiduciary law. Clara closed the file slowly. Jonathan believed he had removed her from the house. He had forgotten she still understood the foundation. And foundations, once cracked, do not collapse quietly. Vanessa Cole did not enter Mercer Global Holdings quietly. She entered as strategy. 3 weeks after Clara left the mansion, Jonathan formally introduced Vanessa to the board as a strategic transformation advisor during an executive session held on the 42nd floor of Mercer Tower. The skyline reflected behind her as she stood poised at the head of the long glass table, dressed in understated navy, posture confident, voice controlled. Jonathan framed it as evolution. "We are entering a more aggressive expansion cycle," he announced. "Vanessa brings fresh alignment." The word alignment echoed deliberately. Several board members exchanged looks. Mercer Global had built its dominance on disciplined risk management. Sudden alignment changes were rarely casual. Vanessa began presenting slides outlining operational restructuring, streamlining divisions, eliminating legacy redundancies, consolidating decision authority. Her tone was polished, persuasive, rehearsed. "This is about eliminating friction," she explained. "Legacy structures slow modern growth." Legacy. The word did not go unnoticed. One senior board member, Thomas Caldwell, leaned back in his chair. "Some of these legacy structures were built during our most stable growth years." Vanessa smiled slightly. "Stability can also mask stagnation." Jonathan intervened before resistance built. "We cannot afford emotional attachments to outdated frameworks." Caldwell's eyes sharpened. "This feels personal." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "It's strategic." The room quieted, but skepticism remained. Within days, 2 long-standing executives, both hired during Clara's early influence in the company, were reassigned under the pretense of operational recalibration. One quietly resigned. The other was sidelined into a ceremonial advisory role with no real authority. Vanessa understood optics, but she underestimated history. The removed executives had been loyal not just to Jonathan, but to the structural discipline Clara once enforced. Outside the boardroom, Vanessa intensified her private influence. "You need clean separation," she told Jonathan one evening in his penthouse office. "The divorce needs to move faster. Delay signals weakness." Jonathan stood at the window, city lights beneath him. "The legal process takes time." "Not if you control the narrative," Vanessa replied. "Limit her access. Freeze discretionary accounts. Accelerate settlement." He turned toward her slowly. "She's pregnant." Vanessa did not soften. "And you're a CEO. Compassion doesn't restructure empires." Her tone carried not cruelty, but calculation. Within the week, Clara's joint financial access was restricted under revised internal policy tied to executive risk mitigation. The justification was technical. The timing was deliberate. Jonathan began appearing publicly with sharper edges in interviews. When asked about leadership philosophy, he spoke about decisive elimination of inefficiencies. He no longer referenced partnership or family stability. Investors noticed the shift. So did analysts. Mercer Global's stock responded uneasily to rapid executive turnover and strategic redirection. Small volatility spikes appeared across trading sessions. Nothing catastrophic, yet. But markets read instability faster than press releases could contain it. Vanessa dismissed the fluctuations. "Short-term noise," she told Jonathan confidently. He believed her. Across the city, Clara did not respond publicly. She did not give interviews. She did not comment on Vanessa's appearances beside Jonathan at industry conferences. Silence became her shield. Privately, however, she assembled a different kind of team. Through Eleanor Whitaker's firm, Clara retained forensic accountants specializing in executive asset movement and fiduciary compliance. They worked quietly, requesting public filings, tracing subsidiary formations, analyzing capital shifts. Patterns emerged. Consulting fees paid to Vanessa's firm increased sharply during the weeks preceding the asset restructuring. Payments were routed through a newly formed subsidiary that coincided with Jonathan's late-night filings. Timing suggests premeditation, one accountant reported. Clara reviewed the documentation slowly. And shareholder disclosure? Incomplete, the accountant replied. The advisory relationship wasn't formally disclosed until after restructuring began. That detail mattered. If Vanessa influenced corporate restructuring while benefiting financially from related consulting arrangements that were not transparently disclosed, regulatory scrutiny could escalate beyond marital conflict. Meanwhile, tension inside Mercer Tower grew. At a subsequent board meeting, Caldwell confronted Jonathan directly. "We are seeing internal disruption and market instability. What assurances do we have that personal matters aren't influencing executive decisions?" Jonathan's response was immediate, almost sharp. "My personal life has zero impact on corporate governance." Vanessa remained silent this time, observing the fracture lines forming beneath them. After the meeting, she confronted Jonathan privately. "You're letting them question you." "They're questioning the speed," he replied irritably. "They're questioning weakness," Vanessa corrected. "Remove it." Jonathan stared at her for a long moment, weighing ambition against optics. He chose ambition. That night, Clara received a call from Eleanor's office. A junior associate had discovered something embedded within Mercer Global's early governance charter, a clause Clara herself had once insisted upon during the company's vulnerable infancy. It required full transparency of any executive financial entanglements that could influence structural restructuring decisions. Clara had written that safeguard years ago, when Jonathan was still learning caution. She listened carefully as Eleanor explained the implication. If Vanessa's consulting payments intersected with restructuring decisions without disclosure, Eleanor said, Jonathan's asset transfers could be challenged under conflict of interest provisions. Clara felt the pieces align. Jonathan believed he was tightening control by accelerating change. He had forgotten the system was built with safeguards against exactly this type of consolidation. Vanessa wanted status. She wanted proximity to power. But she had stepped into a battlefield governed by bylaws she did not draft. As Clara closed the call, Eleanor added one final observation. There's a dormant shareholder protection clause tied to executive misconduct during material life events. Clara's voice remained steady. And pregnancy qualifies as material. Yes, Eleanor replied quietly. It does. If activated, the clause could invalidate recent asset restructuring entirely, forcing reversal, triggering regulatory reporting, and exposing internal conflicts to federal oversight. Jonathan thought he was removing Clara from the equation. He did not realize she was about to re-enter it through the very structure he trusted most. And once that clause surfaced publicly, the board would have to decide whether to protect its CEO. Or protect the company. Jonathan Mercer believed control was a performance. As long as he maintained posture, the structure would hold. He underestimated what happens when someone who knows the foundation better than the architect decides to test it. The emergency injunction was filed at 8:12 a.m. on a Monday morning. Clara Mercer did not announce it. She did not warn Jonathan. She allowed the system to deliver the shock. The filing alleged fraudulent asset shielding, breach of fiduciary duty, and executive misconduct during a material marital transition with direct shareholder impact. The language was sharp but precise. It did not sound emotional. It sounded surgical. By 10:30 a.m., financial media outlets began circulating alerts. Mercer CEO faces legal challenge from pregnant spouse. Emergency motion questions recent asset transfers. Shareholder risk exposure alleged. Jonathan first heard about the filing during a strategy call with international partners. His assistant slipped a tablet beside him mid-sentence. He scanned the headline once, then again, disbelief tightening his expression. She wouldn't dare, he muttered under his breath. But she had. Clara appeared in court that afternoon wearing a simple charcoal suit, her posture steady despite the visible weight of pregnancy. She did not look vengeful. She looked prepared. Eleanor Whitaker stood beside her, calm and controlled, carrying binders thick with documentation. Vanessa watched the news coverage from Jonathan's office, her composure thinning. "This is optics manipulation," she said quickly. "She's weaponizing sympathy." Jonathan paced behind the desk. "She doesn't have the leverage." Vanessa didn't answer immediately. She had seen the filing's summary. The allegations were not emotional appeals. They were structural attacks. Inside the courtroom, Eleanor addressed the judge with clarity. "Your Honor, we are not here to litigate a marriage," she began. "We are here because executive asset restructuring occurred within weeks of a foreseeable legal separation, without proper disclosure of consulting entanglements that may constitute conflict of interest." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Are you alleging corporate fraud?" "We are alleging potential breach of fiduciary duty and improper shielding of marital assets in violation of governance transparency requirements." Clara remained silent, hands folded. Evidence was presented in chronological sequence. Timeline inconsistencies between asset transfers and public corporate disclosures. Consulting payments routed to Vanessa Cole's firm shortly before restructuring decisions. Board notifications delayed beyond standard compliance windows. Jonathan's legal counsel argued aggressively that all restructuring fell within executive authority. "Strategic realignment is not misconduct," his attorney stated. Eleanor did not flinch. "Strategic realignment influenced by undisclosed financial entanglements is." The courtroom atmosphere tightened. Outside, media vans lined the block. Analysts debated whether this was a marital dispute or a governance crisis. Share prices dipped by mid-afternoon as investors reacted to uncertainty. Vanessa's panic surfaced privately that evening. "You told me this was clean," she said sharply, closing the office door behind her. "It is clean," Jonathan snapped back. "She's stretching interpretation." "Federal regulators don't care about interpretation," Vanessa replied. "They care about documentation." Jonathan's confidence showed its first visible crack. He had assumed Clara would negotiate quietly, accept settlement, protect reputation. He had forgotten she once drafted the compliance frameworks that now boxed him in. Back in court the following morning, Eleanor introduced the dormant shareholder protection clause Clara had helped implement years earlier. The provision required enhanced disclosure during material life events that could alter executive judgment or financial distribution patterns. Jonathan's attorney objected, calling it irrelevant to marital circumstances. The judge disagreed. If executive conduct during a personal transition materially affects shareholder stability, the judge said evenly, it becomes relevant. The ruling was immediate and temporary, but devastating. The court ordered a freeze on specific asset transfers pending full review. Not permanent reversal. Not yet. But enough to halt momentum. Jonathan sat rigid as the decision was read. Vanessa stared forward, calculating exit strategies she had never considered before. By late afternoon, Mercer Global's board convened an emergency session. Caldwell spoke first. "We need assurance this is contained." Jonathan's voice carried strain he tried to suppress. "It is a domestic dispute escalated unnecessarily." Another director interjected. "Our stock dropped 4% in a day." "That is not domestic." Silence followed. Clara did not attend the board meeting. She didn't need to. The filing spoke for her. That night, news networks framed the case as a cautionary tale of executive overreach. Commentators debated whether Jonathan's personal decisions had compromised corporate governance. Sympathy for Clara intensified, not because she sought it, but because she remained composed while visibly vulnerable. At her temporary apartment, Clara reviewed the day's developments with Eleanor. She did not celebrate. "This is only the first breach," Eleanor warned. "He will fight." "I expect him to," Clara replied quietly. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. Eleanor glanced at it. Ignore it for now. The phone buzzed again. Then a message appeared. I work inside Mercer Global. What you're looking for goes deeper than consulting payments. Check internal audit emails from 6 weeks ago. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. Attached was a single screenshot, partial email header, timestamped before the restructuring filings. Subject line, disclosure timing adjustment. Eleanor's expression shifted from calm to alert. Forward that immediately. Clara did. Jonathan believed the worst of the damage was temporary, market volatility, reputational strain, legal maneuvering. He still assumed control would stabilize everything. He did not yet know that someone inside his own company had just decided to speak. And internal exposure collapses empires faster than lawsuits ever could. Empires rarely collapse because of one dramatic mistake. They collapse because small concealed decisions accumulate until the weight of secrecy exceeds the strength of reputation. Mercer Global had been built on ambition, precision, and control. But beneath that polished exterior, quiet adjustments had begun to surface, adjustments someone inside the company had finally decided were too dangerous to ignore. The anonymous message Clara received was not emotional. It was clinical. An attachment followed within minutes, archived internal emails forwarded through an encrypted channel. The sender identified themselves only as a junior financial analyst assigned to the CFO's compliance review team. Clara forwarded the files immediately to Eleanor Whitaker and her forensic specialists. The email chain revealed something Jonathan had insisted did not exist: pre-decision consultation between Vanessa Cole and senior finance officers weeks before her advisory role was publicly disclosed. Vanessa had not merely advised after restructuring discussions began. She had shaped them before formal documentation was filed. One email stood out. Vanessa to Jonathan, we should accelerate disclosure adjustment before Q3 audit triggers external review. Waiting invites scrutiny. Jonathan's reply was brief, handle through internal channel. No board escalation. Clara read that line twice. No board escalation. That phrase carried consequences. If executive restructuring decisions involving material asset transfers were intentionally kept from full board review, the issue extended beyond marital conflict. It moved into potential governance violation. Another attachment showed Vanessa's consulting firm billing Mercer Global for strategic restructuring advisement dated before her official contract approval. The billing codes referenced internal projections not yet public. That meant access to insider financial modeling. Clara closed her eyes briefly, not in overwhelm, but in confirmation. Vanessa had not simply influenced Jonathan emotionally. She had inserted herself into the company's structural core before formal transparency requirements were met. Eleanor's voice over speakerphone was steady. This creates exposure under federal securities law. Jonathan, meanwhile, remained unaware of the depth of the leak. He assumed the injunction freeze was the peak of disruption. In his office, he paced while Vanessa stood across from him, tension no longer disguised by elegance. You said everything was clean, she demanded quietly. It is clean, Jonathan replied, but his certainty wavered. Then why are compliance emails surfacing? She pressed. His eyes sharpened. What emails? Vanessa hesitated a fraction too long. He understood instantly. You corresponded before we formalized your position. You told me to help you fix it, she shot back. You said the board was too slow. Jonathan's control slipped. You weren't supposed to document it. The sentence hung heavy in the room. For the first time, Vanessa saw not the decisive visionary, but the man who believed momentum could outpace oversight. Rumors began circulating across financial forums. Anonymous posts referenced potential SEC interest in Mercer Global's restructuring. Analysts noted unusual billing patterns. Market confidence trembled further. Clara did not move prematurely. She did not release the emails publicly. Instead, Eleanor coordinated discreet communication with regulatory counsel, ensuring proper submission under protected whistleblower provisions. Strategic patience mattered. Public sympathy gradually shifted. Clara, visibly pregnant and composed, had filed legal action without spectacle. Jonathan, increasingly defensive in interviews, insisted the company remain stable. His tone sounded less visionary and more reactive. At a private board dinner, Caldwell confronted him again. "Are there internal communications we should be aware of?" Jonathan held his gaze. "No." That answer, delivered too quickly, deepened suspicion rather than resolving it. Vanessa felt isolation creeping closer. Corporate allies stopped returning calls as quickly. Invitations became conditional. She realized something uncomfortable: Jonathan would protect himself before protecting her. "You promised me partnership," she said one evening. "I promised expansion," he replied coldly. "Don't confuse the two." The fracture between them widened. Back in Eleanor's office, Clara reviewed a compliance memo drafted by the Internal Audit Department 6 weeks before the restructuring filings. The memo recommended delaying asset transfers until board disclosure thresholds were met. The recommendation had been overridden by Jonathan. The paper trail no longer suggested oversight gaps. It suggested intentional acceleration. Eleanor leaned back slowly. If regulators confirm pre-disclosure advisory influence combined with asset shielding during a material marital transition, they won't treat this as domestic. Clara's voice was quiet but firm. They'll treat it as governance failure. Late the following afternoon, news alerts began flashing across financial terminals. SEC reviewing Mercer Global restructuring practices. The wording was careful, but unmistakable. Within 24 hours, a formal notice arrived at Mercer Tower. Preliminary inquiry opened. Jonathan read the document alone in his office, the walls of glass no longer feeling like advantage but exposure. Vanessa stood near the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or retreat. He folded the notice slowly. "This is procedural," he muttered. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Across the city, Clara received confirmation from Eleanor. The SEC has initiated a preliminary investigation into Mercer Global's recent asset transfers and compliance disclosures. Clara closed her laptop gently. Jonathan had believed removing her from his house would simplify his world. He had forgotten that the systems he trusted most were built to detect imbalance. And now, federal scrutiny had entered the equation. This was no longer about marriage. It was about survival. The fall did not begin with shouting. It began with headlines. By midweek, every major financial network had shifted its programming to cover the Securities and Exchange Commission's preliminary inquiry into Mercer Global Holdings. Analysts dissected compliance filings in real time. Legal experts debated fiduciary exposure. What had started as a marital dispute had transformed into a governance crisis broadcast across national television. Jonathan Mercer watched his own image replayed repeatedly on screen, once framed as visionary, now accompanied by phrases like alleged disclosure failures and executive overreach. The narrative no longer belonged to him. Mercer Global's stock opened down 6%. By noon, it had fallen nearly 12%. Inside Mercer Tower, emergency protocols activated. Senior executives moved through corridors with tight expressions, avoiding press stationed in the lobby. An emergency board session was scheduled for 4 p.m. Jonathan entered the boardroom to a silence that felt colder than accusation. The directors no longer appeared cautious, they appeared calculating. Caldwell spoke first. "We need immediate clarity." Jonathan remained standing. "This is a preliminary inquiry. Nothing has been proven." "Markets don't wait for proof," another director replied. "They respond to risk." Investors began demanding direct answers. Major institutional shareholders requested private briefings. Some hinted at reconsidering long-term positions if governance instability continued. Meanwhile, Vanessa Cole had begun repositioning herself. Her public relations advisor issued a brief statement describing her as an independent consultant with no executive authority over asset disclosures. The wording subtly separated her from direct responsibility. Jonathan noticed. He confronted her in his office late that evening, the city lights casting harsh reflections across the glass walls. "You're distancing yourself," he said flatly. Vanessa did not deny it. "I have my own firm to protect." "You told me you controlled this," she shot back. "You said the board would follow." "You pushed me into accelerating it," Jonathan snapped. "You insisted speed was power." Vanessa's composure cracked for the first time. "I advised. You decided." Silence followed. In that silence, both understood something irreversible had occurred. Partnership had shifted into blame. Across town, Clara prepared to make her first and only public statement since the injunction filing. Eleanor stood beside her in a quiet conference room before the press conference began. "You don't owe them emotion," Eleanor said. Clara nodded. When she stepped to the podium the next morning, cameras captured not drama, but restraint. Her pregnancy was visible beneath a simple navy dress. She did not look triumphant. She looked composed. "This matter was never about personal revenge," Clara began. "It is about accountability. Leadership requires transparency, especially when decisions affect shareholders, employees, and families." Reporters pressed for comment about Vanessa. Clara did not take the bait. "My focus remains on ensuring that corporate governance standards are upheld," she said calmly. Nothing more. The contrast was powerful. Social media surged with support. Images of Clara leaving the courthouse weeks earlier, standing steady despite her condition, resurfaced. Public opinion shifted decisively in her favor. She had not shouted. She had not attacked. She had insisted on process. Jonathan, by comparison, appeared defensive in interviews. His answers grew shorter, more rigid. When asked whether personal decisions influence corporate timing, he responded sharply, "My private life has no bearing on Mercer Global." The clip went viral, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Corporate partners began protecting themselves. A major logistics contract was temporarily suspended pending regulatory clarity. A tech collaboration agreement entered review status. Suppliers quietly reassessed risk exposure. Inside Mercer Tower, tension intensified. At the emergency board session, one director presented updated projections. "If volatility continues at this rate, we risk long-term institutional withdrawal." Caldwell folded his hands. "We need stabilization." Jonathan felt the shift. It was subtle but unmistakable. He was no longer being defended. He was being evaluated. Vanessa did not attend that session. She cited a scheduling conflict. In truth, she understood optics. After the meeting, Jonathan confronted Caldwell privately. "You can't be considering removal based on speculation." Caldwell held his gaze. "We are considering preservation of the company." That word, preservation, echoed. Late that night, Jonathan stood alone in his office. The same skyline that once symbolized dominance now felt like silent judgment. He replayed the moment he had ordered Clara out of the house. He had believed eliminating perceived weakness would sharpen his authority. Instead, it had exposed fault lines he did not anticipate. His phone buzzed with an internal memo alert. Emergency board vote scheduled. Subject line, Executive Leadership Review. The meeting was set for 48 hours later. Jonathan read the notice twice. Outside his office door, conversation stopped when he approached. Across the city, Clara sat quietly reviewing case updates with Eleanor, unaware that the next escalation had already been formalized. The board was no longer discussing containment. They were preparing to decide whether Mercer Global could survive with Jonathan Mercer at its helm. And for the first time since he built the empire, his position was no longer guaranteed. The morning of the vote arrived without ceremony. No press statements were issued. No interviews scheduled. Mercer Tower stood under a gray sky as if the building itself understood the weight inside it. On the 42nd floor, the boardroom doors closed with a quiet finality that felt heavier than any headline. Jonathan Mercer entered without entourage. He had built this empire from a folding desk and borrowed capital. Every framed acquisition certificate lining the hallway carried his name. Every expansion plan had once required his signature. Today, those same walls felt less like tribute and more like evidence. Around the table sat 12 directors. Their expressions were controlled, but the shift in allegiance was visible in their posture. This was no longer advisory. It was judgment. Vanessa Cole was absent. She had submitted a written statement through legal counsel affirming her limited advisory capacity. The distance was intentional. Jonathan noticed. Caldwell opened the session. This is an executive leadership review prompted by regulatory exposure, market instability, and potential fiduciary breach. Jonathan stood rather than sit. Before this proceeds, I want it on record that Mercer Global's restructuring was strategic and lawful. Eleanor Whitaker sat near the far end of the table, not as an employee, but as legal proxy representing Clara Mercer's activated voting shares. The room understood what that meant. Clara's dormant equity, long dismissed as irrelevant, had been formally reinstated for this vote. Jonathan's eyes met Eleanor's briefly. The message was clear: Clara was present without physically being there. Caldwell continued. We will review documentation submitted by counsel. Screens lit up around the room displaying timelines of asset transfers, internal compliance memos, and consulting invoices tied to Vanessa's firm. The sequence was clinical, undeniable. One director spoke first. Why were compliance recommendations overridden? Jonathan's jaw tightened. Speed was necessary. Necessary for what? Another asked. For strategic positioning. Eleanor's voice entered calmly. Strategic positioning that coincided with undisclosed advisory compensation and material marital transition. The words were measured, not emotional. That precision made them sharper. Jonathan turned toward her. This is a personal dispute being reframed as governance failure. Eleanor did not blink. Governance does not recognize personal excuses. Silence stretched. Caldwell leaned forward. Jonathan, investors have expressed loss of confidence. The SEC inquiry remains active. Our obligation is to the corporation. And I am the corporation, Jonathan replied, frustration edging his tone. No, Caldwell answered evenly. You founded it. That is not the same. The distinction landed harder than accusation. Voting shares were confirmed. Clara's early equity stake, combined with two directors who had shifted positions overnight, altered the outcome calculus significantly. Jonathan exhaled slowly. If you remove me now, you validate speculation. If we keep you, another director responded, we validate risk. The vote proceeded electronically. One by one, confirmations registered on the secure panel embedded into the table. Jonathan watched the tally appear in real time. It was not unanimous. But it was decisive. By majority vote, Jonathan Mercer was removed as Chief Executive Officer of Mercer Global Holdings, effective immediately. The room did not erupt. There was no applause, no visible relief. Only procedural transition. An interim CEO was appointed, an experienced operations executive known for stability rather than ambition. A press release draft was prepared before the meeting ended. Jonathan remained standing even after the vote concluded. For a moment, no one spoke. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Caldwell met his gaze. "We are correcting one." Outside the building, news alerts began flashing across trading terminals before Jonathan had even reached the elevator. Inside Eleanor's office across town, Clara received confirmation. She did not smile. She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the shift. "Do you want to assume a formal role?" Eleanor asked. Clara shook her head. No. She had no interest in symbolic victory. Instead, she submitted a written request to the board recommending immediate independent governance restructuring, compliance audits, executive compensation review, and external oversight committees to prevent future concentration of authority. She was not claiming the throne. She was redesigning the system. Back at Mercer Tower, Jonathan collected a single leather briefcase from his office. The nameplate had already been removed from his desk. Assistants avoided direct eye contact. In the lobby, cameras waited. He exited without statement. In the silence of his now empty penthouse later that evening, Jonathan received a formal notification from the board's compensation committee. Subject: Executive Compensation Review and Clawback Assessment. He opened the document slowly. Due to ongoing regulatory investigation and confirmed fiduciary exposure, his executive compensation package, including performance bonuses and deferred stock awards, was under immediate clawback review. This was not just removal. It was reversal. Jonathan lowered himself into a chair, staring at the skyline that once reflected his dominance. He had thrown his pregnant wife into the rain believing power required elimination of weakness. Now the empire he built had erased his name from its leadership. And the final financial consequences had only just begun. 3 days after the vote, Jonathan Mercer stood at a podium in Mercer Tower's lobby, cameras stacked like rifles. He read a short resignation letter, claiming he was stepping down for the good of the company, then refused questions. The board released its own statement minutes later, confirming his resignation from the board as well, not voluntary but mutually agreed. Markets didn't applaud, they exhaled. On television, experts replayed the clip beside footage of Clara in the rain, 8 months pregnant, escorted out by security. In replay, Jonathan's face looked smaller, as if the building him no longer recognized today. The compensation committee's decision landed that afternoon, clawback confirmed. Performance bonuses were reversed, deferred stock awards frozen, and a portion of prior payouts demanded back under misconduct provisions. Jonathan's attorney called it punitive, but the board chair called it mathematics. When Jonathan tried to access a private account tied to those awards, the portal displayed a single sentence: access restricted pending review. He slammed his phone onto the counter, then stared at his own reflection in the black glass, watching rage turn into fear. For the time, money didn't obey him, and he realized his name no longer protected him. Vanessa Cole vanished with the same precision she once used to enter rooms. Her website went dark, her social accounts stopped updating, and a rented townhouse emptied overnight. Reporters camped outside, but the blinds stayed closed. A former friend leaked that Vanessa had booked a one-way flight under a different surname, yet no outlet could confirm it. Jonathan texted her twice, then called, each time the line rang until it failed. He understood the message. She wasn't loyal to him, only to momentum, and momentum had shifted away. In silence, he felt how disposable a man becomes when power leaves. Clara went into labor at dawn, far from marble foyers and boardroom glare. Eleanor arrived at the hospital with paperwork, not flowers, because protection mattered even now. Clara delivered a boy with a full head of dark hair and an unexpectedly strong cry, and for a moment the corporate war fell quiet inside her chest. She named him Miles, a reminder that life moves forward regardless of men who try to control it. By evening, news sites framed the birth beside the scandal, a morality lesson about leadership and accountability. Clara watched none of it, focusing on breath and promise. Weeks later, Clara returned to Whitaker and Doyle with a new rhythm: feedings, filings, and quiet endurance. She didn't seek spotlight, she sought leverage that couldn't be taken at a gate. The foundation of her revenge was competence. When the interim CEO invited her to accept an advisory seat on Mercer Global's Governance Reform Committee, she agreed on one condition: full transparency and independent oversight, including protections for future spouses and employees. "This isn't about punishing Jonathan," she told the board. "It's about preventing the next Jonathan." The directors nodded, relieved to see strength that didn't demand a crown today. The public loved a clean story, and the networks packaged Mercer Global's chaos into a weekly morality segment. Clips of Jonathan preaching family values from old interviews played beside footage of Clara leaving court, one hand on her belly, the other holding documents. Commentators called it a lesson in leadership, how arrogance turns into liability. Sponsors pulled from Jonathan's speaking circuit, and a university rescinded an honorary lecture he had been scheduled to deliver. Each cancellation was quiet, polite, and irreversible, the way high society punishes without raising its voice. By his name sounded like a warning, not a brand. Jonathan tried to rebuild his story through interviews, but producers stopped calling. Former allies offered polite distance. Even his father's country club suspended his membership, citing reputational review, and the phrase tasted like rust. One night he drove to a quiet park near Clara's temporary building, sitting in the car for an hour before texting, "Can we talk?" Clara hesitated, then agreed to meet in the lobby under cameras she controlled. When Jonathan walked in, he looked older, not from age but from being unseen. He kept glancing at the security desk, remembering the night he ordered her removed outside. They stood near the elevator bank, fluorescent light flattening whatever charm he once weaponized. "Was it worth destroying everything?" Jonathan asked, voice low. Clara didn't raise her voice either. "You destroyed it the night you chose power over responsibility," she replied. He swallowed, eyes flicking toward her wedding ring, gone, then toward the stroller beside her. "I thought I was securing the company," he said. "You were securing your ego," Clara answered. "And ego always sends the bill later." Jonathan's mouth opened, but no defense came. Behind her calm, he sensed something colder than anger, the certainty that she could finish him. Clara ended the meeting first. "You should go," she said, not cruelly, but with finality. Jonathan stepped back, as if expecting security to grab him again, then remembered he no longer had men to command. In the following weeks, the clawback process finalized, and Mercer Global scrubbed his name from internal leadership pages. Vanessa remained absent, a rumor with no address. Clara returned upstairs to her son, to case files, to a life rebuilt on rules. Down in the street, Jonathan stared at the doors, realizing exile can be legal. So what should never be traded: love, loyalty, or integrity? If stories about power, reputation, and the consequences of leadership decisions matter to you, this channel is built for you. These aren't just dramatic moments, they're lessons about how quickly success can unravel. If you value thoughtful, real-world stories like this, stay connected and be part of the conversation.